uranium conversion prices have just spiked to levels above $100. I believe 120 to be specific, and that really is a big thing, as it can be a cause for overfeeding, which leads to increased demand for yellow cake, and it could be quite the positive catalyst for the uranium price. And the most interesting part really is that most of these catalysts that are now moving the uranium market, they weren't even around back in 2018, and the uranium thesis appeared to me to be the strongest thesis back then. And now it just appears to me as if it's getting much better, which I think it is. Now, according to Menachem, a Twitter buddy of mine who looked over the WNA report, there is enough uranium enrichment capacity to go us around, even without what's coming from Russia. So this weekend, during my conversation with Brandon Munro, I got to ask him why enrichment prices have been exploding as of recently, while we appear to have enough supply, and what that means for the uranium thesis over the long term. So I'll show you that clip here in a second. But during the full conversation, we also talked about the mergers and acquisitions situation in uranium and why they're so important in the market in general. As well as I got to ask Brandon about the 25% of his shares in Bannerman that he sold earlier last year at a less than ideal price. So that video is free to view if you care. You can probably find it on resourcesox.com or in some link somewhere, wherever. So if you care, you can watch it. But anyways, let's watch the video now. And so a friend of mine on Twitter, Menachem, by the way, shout out to him. He told me that he looked over the WNA report in regards to the uranium conversion capacity, and it seemed like there's plenty of it to go around, even without Russia, even considering what's happening right now. So he wanted me to ask you why you think the conversion prices have been spiking lately, if there is enough conversion to go around.
Yeah, so look, the conversion market functions slightly differently to the enrichment market. So in conversion, there is some excess capacity that can be brought on through the Metropolis plant in the US. However, that will only come on if there's long-term contracts for that production. So they don't want to build and wait for them to come. So they want to only build if they've got long-term contracts to offset against their expansion costs. But it's there, they can do it. They've got the approvals, the permits, the regulation to be able to do that. Now, the reason why they're not doing that at the moment is because many of these companies have got their LEU or their enriched material contracted with Russia. And it's not a simple job for the US utilities to just turn around and say, look, we really disapprove of what's happening in Ukraine. It's a disgrace and we're going to break our contracts. It just doesn't work like that in this sector. What they would have to do is wait until, or if or when, the US government creates a force majeure event for them by sanctioning US material. Now, when that happens, they'll very quickly need to try and get at the front of the queue with their contracts with Convidine, for example, at the Metropolis Works facility. So what we're seeing in that pricing is probably a little bit of speculative front running of that event. And because if the US government does introduce sanctions, well, then you've got a large number of parties that suddenly have to find a new source of conversion. And as per enrichment as well, there just aren't many choices that they've got to quickly cover off that hole that they will have in their conversion supply. And you can say similar types of things about enrichment. It's more acute because Russia provides 40% of the world's enrichment. And the other nice thing about enrichment for a uranium investor is that would immediately leave the Western enrichers in a position where they would have to overfeed to be able to provide sufficient LEU to the industry over the next several years.
Mm-hmm. There might be a question there too, by the way, because the way I understood it, and I guess maybe a sort of an explanation here that you can correct me on if I'm wrong, maybe for the people who are unsure, but also for me. What I'm referring to when I'm talking about enrichment or enricher companies so first of all, you have the miners, right? They take the rock out of the ground, they mill it, turn it into yellow chalk looking thing, I guess, which is a thing called yellow cake. They put it into drums and sell it. That's where the cycle ends for the miners, at least. Now that's not nuclear fuel. I literally used to think that in 2018 when I first got into it. I thought that's nuclear fuel. They feed it in some sort of a way to the reactor, but that's not it. There is a very important step between the yellow cake and the fuel platelets. And that's, there's a few steps, I guess, really, but the one that we're discussing here is where the uranium gets enriched, which is sort of the process. The way that I understand it is the process where the value of the U-235, that's the uranium isotope, the value of it in the yellow cake, in the chalky looking thing, is about 1%. And in that process, it goes from 1 to between 3 and 5%. That's what it's called, LEU, low enriched uranium. That's what it is. And so that business of uranium enrichment, though, from what I found online, is not a great business to begin with. It's not as profitable because uranium is a very dense fuel, so we don't need as much of it as we need like coal or oil or something like that. So one enricher can do quite a lot of enrichment, and if a second would come online, that would sort of kill the price because there's going to be oversupply, basically. So, by the way, that's because of, again, coal. I said that, right? Coal and oil are less dense than uranium. But so the people who would also work at those facilities of the enrichers, that do the enrichment, like the actual staff, they'll have to be highly educated and therefore rather expensive. There's also risks and risk premiums and stuff like that, so on and so forth. And all this makes enrichment an expensive process for the enricher. But at the same time, the enrichment business is extremely strictly regulated, because enrichment, if you bring it to highly enriched uranium, which is over 20%, could be used for weapons. And basically, it's not what we want, right? And so you have Russia, who leads the charge for enrichment, as you said. Then you have France does some, but it's mostly for their own reactors. And then the US does some, definitely not a lot. It still imports a lot from Russia, as you also mentioned. And I think Canada does enrichment as well, right? But so the companies who bring the yellow cake to, I guess they bring it to gas, and then they make the concentration of the U-235 isotope go from 1 to between 3 and 5%. Those companies, that's the enrichers. And they have historically not been great businesses, if I'm not mistaken. And so the question that I thought of before I went on this rant, Brandon, was, wouldn't what's going on right now be bullish news for those companies, for the uranium enrichment companies outside of the Eastern Bloc, basically?
Yeah, you would think so. It was a pretty good summary. There's a couple of bits and pieces that I could correct you on, but I think the general tone of what you described is fine. Now, they have been, over time, very successful businesses. And remember that a lot of the enrichment, so Urenco, for example, it's not necessarily right to think of it as a business. Yes, it is a business and it does do what a business does, but it's a multilateral organization. So it's essentially a partnership between the German, Dutch, and British governments. And that is because nuclear power is, of course, such an important part of a country's energy security. And they didn't want to leave that in the early days when all of these things were being figured out. They didn't want to leave that just to a couple of private companies. They wanted to make sure that they could combine forces. And so Urenco has a number of enrichment facilities around the place. Not many, it's got a few. So what happened is, before Fukushima, the enrichment companies foresaw that there would be a big requirement for enrichment as nuclear power grew. And the lead times, because of permitting, as you mentioned, but also the capital investment required for an enrichment facility, meant that they needed to be thinking about that well in advance. So they really had to look over the horizon as to what the prospects for nuclear power were going to be. And that, of course, the nuclear renaissance was on back in those days, and the prospects were very, very good. So they invested. And then Fukushima happened, which first of all punched a 10% hole in demand as Japan and Germany closed down their reactors.
Right.
but also really flattened the forward demand curve for 10 years as we went into this big bear market. So the enrichers found themselves having already jumped and already done this huge investment in extra capacity, and they found then they had excess capacity, and that led to the phenomenon of underfeeding, which is a large contributor of secondary supplies of uranium. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean enrichment's a bad business in any way. Like, it's actually a very good business. It's just that it's a business that for a number of years was wearing the impacts of a large part of their market flattening off. And so for that reason, it's been a tough business and quite a challenging business. Now, what does all that mean to the situation today? Well, it means that those businesses are going to be very reticent to expand unless they feel very confident in what they're seeing in the future. And the thing about a political distortion, which is what sanctions boils down to, is political distortions are very sudden, but they can also be reversed. And so it's very hard for an enrichment company to say, look, we're going to put down $5 billion building a new enrichment plant because there's sanctions. They need a lot of confidence that that situation is going to prevail. Now, they've got confidence to a degree because they're starting to form their own view, as I am, that we've got a very positive demand profile, broadly speaking, for nuclear power. And then you've got SMRs, which are going to require a lot more enrichment. But they're still perhaps a bit gun shy because of the place that they were left after Fukushima. So it's not an easy it's not an easy equation to be solved. What it's more likely to do is, particularly if Russian enrichment can't be accessed for Western utilities, it's more likely going to be a sustained period of shortage before there's enough momentum to justify this sort of capital levels of expansion in the enrichment sector.
So
now, where that gets really interesting for uranium is that enrichment and uranium are interlinked, because if there's a shortage of enrichment, you can push a lot more uranium into the system through a process called overfeeding, and you still get the nuclear fuel that you can fabricate into fuel rods. It's just that it's an inefficient process using the uranium because you're wanting to conserve the enrichment. So we could talk a lot about the process of enrichment and underfeeding and overfeeding, and maybe we'd do that at another time. But a number of folks in the uranium thesis are starting to understand it quite well. But for people who've never heard of that, to produce LEU, which is the enriched uranium that you talked about, there's a certain amount of uranium and a certain amount of enrichment called separative work units that go into the mix. And you can flex. You can use more separative work units and less uranium to get the same amount of low enriched uranium, or you can flip it around and use more uranium and less separative work units. And that's called overfeeding. And the effect is you conserve the amount of enrichment capacity you've got, with the consequence that you consume more natural uranium, more converted yellow cake in the process. And what we're facing, particularly if we see sanctions of Russian material, is that the West will have to adopt a blend, a recipe, where they conserve as much enrichment as they feasibly can. And that, of course, will lead to a short-term increase in uranium, and it will mean that more uranium is used to produce a given result in terms of the number of fuel rods that can go into a nuclear power plant. And that's good for our market, of course.
Yeah, because it increases the demand further beyond what was foreseen when a lot of us got in. Like when I got in, there was all of this was not a part of the plan at all. Like France's 14 new nuclear reactors were not a part of the plan. Belgium doing a U-turn was not a part of the plan, and all the other things that you previously mentioned, all that was not part of the plan, not part of anybody's calculations on supply and demand, because nobody knew it was going to happen. And it's just getting better and better over time. And so that's enrichment. We talked about financing, we talked about M&A, now we talked about enrichment. Those are three of three of my pillars. I have more pillars when it comes down to sentiment, but those are three of my pillars that show me where sentiment is. Because when you see companies moving in each one of those spaces, it tells you something about the space, about the sentiment on the space. But so what else is going on out there, Brandon? Like, let me explain why I'm asking this question, is because sometimes it seems hard to keep up with. Like we have M&A, we have enrichment, we have the SPUT now too. Then we have like ETF flows, we have SPUT taking over the ETF. We have the basics of the structural deficit. They're still there, by the way. Nobody talks about them anymore because they're just so obvious. Then there's countries announcing new reactors, U-turns, and stuff like that. There's a few other things going on as well, but at the same time, there's also a lot of noise in the market, especially in the chatter on message boards and social medias and so on. So, well, maybe I could ask you, how would you rank what's going on out there in the uranium market right now? How would you rank it by importance? Like, what's the most important dynamic of this market right now, and what follows after it, and then after it? How would you rank them?
Right now, so in the short term, it's clearly the appetite for financial investment into this sector. So predominantly that's through SPUT, but of course you've also got Yellowcake, you've got ANU Energy, which is a new vehicle that's been set up in Kazakhstan that's been seeded with $50 million worth of uranium. And there are hedge funds and others who are buying uranium directly and setting up their own converter accounts. They're just not as visible, so harder to talk about. That is the immediate driver. Now, for the last week, that hasn't really had much of an impact. But if you look at it over the next 6 months, the single biggest thing that will impact uranium equities is, via sentiment as a mechanism, will be the flood of funds from generalist investors. So what's quite interesting for you, Antonio, and your farmers and the people that we interact with online is that we feel like this uranium thesis has been around for a while and we understand it and it's all coming true, and that's great. What we don't realize is we are just the tiniest little wedge of the investing population, and we're the well-educated followers of this particular sector. And what we don't understand is we're less than 0.5% of investors out there. And when the generalist investors start to say, oh, gee, I've made good money on copper, I've made good money on iron ore, made really good money on fossil fuels and this and that, where can I start diversifying? And they come to the uranium trade. That is an enormous wall of money that will want to find its way into our small little sector. And where SPUT has been so important, and where we see the interaction between SPUT and URNM, is we've now got quality vehicles that are run by very well credentialed resource houses who are able to deliver that. So no matter how much money wants to come into SPUT, they can handle it. Someone wants to add $1 billion worth of units next week, they would be able to handle it. Now, of course, deploying that into the uranium sector is going to have a dramatic effect. But my point is, it's not like finding new uranium assets. We couldn't find $1 billion worth of new uranium floats to produce enough product for all of these investors to buy equities. But they can just flood into SPUT and channel it pretty much as much money as they want into the uranium market. The same for URNM and URA in particular. Now that they've been established and they're set up as ETFs, they can accommodate almost as much money as generalist investors would want to throw at them. They're then going to be buying their underlying index participants like mad, which would have quite a supportive effect on uranium equities. But my point is that those funnels are there to be able to be almost as large as they need to be when the flow of generalist investors starts to become truly attracted into this sector. And what Ukraine crisis has done for us in the uranium sector, and in particular for nuclear power, is it's reversed a decade-long exercise in negligence by governments around the world where they've ignored energy security. It's like for the last 10 years, particularly since Fukushima, energy security just hasn't been a consideration. Transition has been far more important. ESG has been far more important. All of a sudden, these governments have realized that over the last 100 years, it's only been the last 10 years where they've ignored energy security. And that will start to reconfigure policymakers and bureaucratic decision-making. It already is when it comes to gas, but that will affect every aspect of energy. And that's when I think we'll start to see generalist investors look around and say, are you kidding me? Here's 10% of the world's power in nuclear power, and uranium is the unsubstitutable fuel source for 10% of the world's power, and the whole sector's worth $25 billion. How can that be right? And that's when we'll see them start to come in. And that's where having those funnels already in place in the right hands becomes really important for this sector and uranium equities, realizing the full potentiality of that flow of funds.
Again, if you want to watch or listen to the full conversation, which I really hope you will, you can head over to resourcedocs.com, or if you're on your computer right now, I'll probably put up a box or here's something that you can just click on it and probably take you right there. Again, it is completely free, no registration, no subscription, no nothing. And it's also ad-free.